Benny Angelo was a man who had lived through some of the darkest moments in history and come out the other side with an unbreakable spirit. A proud World War II veteran and a Pearl Harbor survivor, Benny was widely respected in his community of Canton, Ohio. At 87 years old, he was in good health, still sharp-minded and independent. He lived alone in the old family home, a place filled with cherished memories, photographs of his military service, medals earned through bravery, and keepsakes that told the story of a man who had dedicated his life to duty and honor. Despite his age, Benny remained active in veterans organizations, attending local events and staying connected with his fellow servicemen. He was the kind of man who left a lasting impact on those around him. His daughter, Becky Angelo, adored him. Though she lived 2 hours away in Columbus, she made sure to keep in close contact. They spoke regularly, about 3 times a week, sharing stories, laughter, and updates about their lives. Benny was more than just a father. He was a figure of strength and wisdom, a reminder of a generation that had fought for everything they had. On a seemingly normal evening, Becky was at home, assembling an entertainment center with a neighbor when the phone rang. Her brother was on the other end, and his voice carried a weight that sent an immediate chill through her. "Dad's house is on fire," he said, "and it doesn't look good." Panic surged through Becky as she tried calling him back for more details, but he wasn't answering. She was left in a state of helplessness, waiting for more information while fear gripped her. Meanwhile, in Canton, fire trucks raced to Benny's house. Flames devoured the structure, sending thick black smoke into the night sky. Firefighters battled to bring the blaze under control, pushing through the suffocating heat and low visibility to search for Benny. Minutes mattered, and they knew that if he was still inside, every second counted. Fire investigator Joe Carafelli arrived at the scene, knowing that an elderly man trapped in a burning home was almost certainly facing a fatal outcome. His colleagues had already made their way inside, feeling their way through the dense smoke. In Benny's bedroom, they found him. He was unresponsive, showing no signs of life. They pulled him from the burning home and rushed him to waiting paramedics, who desperately tried to resuscitate him. But it was too late. Benny Angelo was gone. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident, a fire that had claimed the life of an elderly man in his sleep. But something wasn't right. When medical examiners checked Benny's mouth and nose for signs of smoke inhalation, they found none. This meant that he had not been breathing when the fire started. He was already dead. The fire wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. Carafelli and his team began investigating the scene. They examined every potential cause of the fire, ruling them out one by one. The stove wasn't the source. The water heater was fine. The electrical wiring showed no signs of malfunction, but what they did find was far more disturbing. The burn patterns in the house suggested that the fire had been deliberately set. Liquor bottles lay scattered around, and it appeared that alcohol had been splashed throughout the house before being ignited. Benny's home had been intentionally torched. The investigation quickly shifted from a fatal fire to a homicide case. As detectives combed through the wreckage, more troubling evidence surfaced. In Benny's bedroom, at the foot of his bed, was his open safe. It was clear that someone had been inside, searching for something. Benny's family confirmed that he always kept a .32 caliber revolver beside his bed. It was missing. When Benny's body was transported to the hospital, doctors made a horrifying discovery. He had been shot 4 times, once in the head, 3 times in the chest. This was no burglary gone wrong. It was an execution. The investigation stalled as detectives struggled to find a suspect. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, leading them to believe that Benny had either willingly let someone in or had been caught off guard. Then a crucial piece of evidence emerged, a single blonde hair found in the mechanism of the front door. It did not belong to Benny nor to anyone in his family. This meant that an outsider had been in the house, someone who had access to the front door. But with no immediate DNA match and no other leads, the case went cold. Months passed. Becky refused to let her father's murder fade into obscurity. She plastered flyers all over town, pinned them to telephone poles, storefront windows, anywhere that people would see them. But the case remained unsolved. Then she had an idea. If criminals talked, maybe someone in jail knew something. She sent a poster to the county jail, asking the sheriff to hang it in the inmate receiving area. The decision proved to be a turning point. One day, Detective George received an anonymous prison tip, a kite, as inmates called it. A female in the most brutal way possible, but justice had finally been served. His community mourned him, his family honored him, and his legacy as a war hero remained intact. Though he was gone, Benny's story was not forgotten. His strength, his resilience, and his sacrifice would live on forever. Even though Chester Crank was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, the case was far from over. Investigators strongly believed that he hadn't acted alone. The nature of Benny Angelo's murder, the ransacked house, the open safe, the missing revolver, pointed to multiple perpetrators. Benny was a tough man, even at 87 years old. His family was convinced that it would have taken more than one person to overpower him. The way the crime was carried out suggested a planned robbery that turned into a killing, not a random break-in. Chester might have pulled the trigger, but who else was involved? And more importantly, why had Benny been targeted? Detectives had a theory. Benny was known to be generous but cautious with his money. As a veteran with strong ties to the community, he had many acquaintances, but not all of them had good intentions. It was rumored that he kept cash and valuables in his safe, something that a close associate or a local with inside knowledge might have known. Perhaps someone had tipped Chester off, someone who knew Benny's habits and that he was unlikely to put up with threats or intimidation. It was clear that whoever had been in Benny's house that night had expected an easy robbery. But things had gone terribly wrong. Despite the conviction, the police weren't closing the case. They needed to find out who had been with Chester that night. They went back to the evidence, searching for anything they might have missed. The blonde hair found at the scene still hadn't been matched to anyone in the system. They ran it through new databases, hoping for a hit, but nothing came up immediately. That meant one of two things. Either the person had no prior criminal record, or they had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA collection. Becky Angelo, still grieving, was relentless in her pursuit of justice. She couldn't shake the feeling that more people were responsible for her father's death, and she refused to let the inmate claimed that another woman, Regina Crank, had been talking about the murder. Regina wasn't just gossiping. She said her cousin had been involved. That cousin's name was Chester Crank. Until that moment, Chester had never been on the police's radar. Regina told detectives that she and Chester had grown up together, practically like siblings. One night, after drinking, Chester had confessed to her. He had told her that he was going to prison for the rest of his life because he had shot and killed someone. That someone was Benny Angelo. With this new lead, investigators did a deep dive into Chester's background. He had a history of felonies, and he lived near Benny's home, close to the spot where Benny's wallet and gun holster had been found. The pieces started fitting together, but detectives needed hard evidence. They made a bold move. They convinced Regina to wear a wire. If she could get Chester to incriminate himself, they would have the confession they needed. It didn't take long. When Regina met with Chester, the hidden microphone picked up everything. He admitted to being involved in Benny's murder. The moment the detectives heard the recording, they knew they had enough. Chester Crank was arrested and charged with arson, murder, robbery, and burglary. The trial lasted 5 days. The defense had no witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury found Chester Crank guilty on all charges. The judge wasted no time in delivering the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the case wasn't truly over. Investigators believed there were at least 3 more people involved, accomplices who had never been caught. Though Chester refused to give up names, authorities remained committed to bringing the others to justice. For Becky, the verdict brought some closure, but she knew her father's case wasn't fully over. She would keep fighting to ensure that every single person responsible was held accountable. Benny Angelo had survived Pearl Harbor, fought in World War II, and lived a long and honorable life. But his final battle had been one he never saw coming. He had been taken from his family in the most brutal way possible, but justice had finally been served. His community mourned him, his family honored him, and his legacy as a war hero remained intact. Though he was gone, Benny's story was not forgotten. His strength, his resilience, and his sacrifice would live on forever. Even though Chester Crank was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, the case was far from over. Investigators strongly believed that he hadn't acted alone. Becky Angelo, still grieving, was relentless in her pursuit of justice. She couldn't shake the feeling that more people were responsible for her father's death, and she refused to let the case fade away just because one person had been convicted. She continued her efforts to keep the case in the public eye, speaking to local news outlets, writing letters to law enforcement, and ensuring that Benny's name wasn't forgotten. Months passed, then a year. Investigators worked quietly in the background, still hunting for Chester's accomplices. Then a breakthrough. Another inmate came forward with information. This time it was someone who had been in prison with Chester after his conviction. The inmate claimed that Chester had bragged about the crime, but had also complained that he was taking the fall alone. According to the informant, Chester had mentioned 2 other people, a man and a woman, who had been with him that night, but he refused to name them outright. This information sent detectives scrambling to build on what they already knew. Chester had mentioned a woman. Could she be the owner of the blonde hair found at the crime scene? If so, she might have been the one who knocked on Benny's door that night, gaining his trust before letting Chester and the others inside. The police started combing through Chester's known associates, looking for a blonde woman with a criminal past. Then another tip came in. Someone had remembered seeing Chester hanging around with a woman named Lisa Harland in the months before Benny's murder. Lisa had a history of drug offenses and petty theft, but nothing violent, at least, not until now. When detectives looked deeper, they found that Lisa had disappeared from Canton not long after Chester's arrest. It was suspicious. Investigators put out a warrant for Lisa's arrest. It took months to track her down. She had moved across state lines, bouncing from town to town, staying under the radar. When police finally caught up with her in Indiana, she didn't resist arrest. But once in custody, she refused to talk. She denied any involvement in Benny Angelo's murder, even when confronted with the evidence against her. Detectives had a problem. They had circumstantial evidence linking Lisa to the crime, her association with Chester, the timing of her disappearance, but they needed something stronger. Then the forensics lab came back with an answer. The blonde hair found at Benny's front door. A perfect DNA match to Lisa Harland. Faced with undeniable proof, Lisa's defenses began to crumble. She finally admitted to being at Benny's house that night, but according to her, she wasn't the killer. She claimed that she had only acted as the distraction, knocking on Benny's door and pretending to need help, while Chester and another man, whom she identified as Travis Greer, forced their way inside. Lisa insisted that she had never intended for Benny to die. She thought they were only there to rob him. But when Benny fought back, things escalated. With Lisa's confession, police now had another name, Travis Greer. He had a long history of violent crimes and had been in and out of prison for years. Unlike Lisa, Travis didn't try to run. He had stayed in Canton, believing that with Chester already locked up, no one would come looking for him. He was wrong. When detectives arrested Travis, he didn't say much. He denied everything at first, then changed his story, blaming Chester for everything. But between Lisa's confession, Chester's prison bragging, and the forensic evidence, there was more than enough to charge him. The trials for Lisa and Travis were separate from Chester's, but the outcomes were the same. Lisa, despite her claims of not pulling the trigger, was convicted of second-degree murder, burglary, and arson. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Travis, identified as one of the main attackers, was convicted of first-degree murder, robbery, and arson. He, like Chester, received life without parole. For Becky Angelo and her family, the convictions brought a bittersweet relief. It had taken years, but now all three people responsible for Benny's murder had been brought to justice. Becky spoke at each of the sentencing hearings, making sure the court knew exactly what had been taken from her family. Her father had survived one of the most horrific attacks on American soil, had fought for his country, and had lived to build a life of meaning and love. He had deserved to live out his days in peace. Instead, he had been betrayed, attacked in his own home, and killed by people who had no respect for life. Chester Crank, Lisa Harland, and Travis Greer were sent to different correctional facilities, all serving lengthy sentences with no hope of release. In their final statements, none of them showed much remorse. Chester remained defiant, insisting he had been framed. Lisa expressed some regret, but mostly for herself. Only Travis, in the end, admitted that what they had done was wrong. But it was too little, too late. For the Angelo family, justice had come at a heavy cost. The pain of losing Benny would never fully heal, but at least now they had answers. They had fought for years to ensure that his case wasn't forgotten, and they had won. In Canton, Benny Angelo's name lived on, not just in the hearts of his family, but in the community that had loved him. A memorial was dedicated in his honor, recognizing his service as a veteran and his legacy as a man of integrity. His story had ended in tragedy, but his memory would never fade. The war hero who had survived Pearl Harbor had fought his last battle, and though he had been taken too soon, he would never be forgotten. The murder of Benny Angelo was a crime that shook his family, his community, and the very fabric of justice. A man who had given so much, who had fought for his country, survived Pearl Harbor, and lived his life with dignity and strength, was taken in the most brutal way imaginable. But in the end, justice prevailed. Chester Crank, Lisa Harland, and Travis Greer all faced the consequences of their actions. It took years of relentless effort from law enforcement, from Becky Angelo, and from those who refused to let Benny's story be forgotten. Through sheer determination, his killers were brought to justice, proving that even when a case goes cold, the truth has a way of surfacing. For Becky, the convictions brought closure, but not peace. Nothing could bring her father back, but knowing that those responsible could never harm another innocent person gave her some comfort. Benny Angelo's name would not be lost in history. His legacy, both as a war hero and as a beloved father and community member, remained untarnished. His story became a symbol, a reminder of the resilience of those left behind and of the unyielding pursuit of justice in the face of tragedy. But Benny's case is just one of many. There are still families out there waiting for justice, still names that have been forgotten, and still killers walking free. This is why cases like Benny Angelo's must continue to be told. If you know something, if you have any information about an unsolved crime, don't stay silent, speak up. A single tip, a single piece of evidence could be the key to solving another case, to bringing another family the closure they deserve. Justice is never automatic. It takes persistence, it takes courage, and most of all, it takes people who refuse to let the memory of their loved ones fade away. Benny Angelo's story proves one thing: no matter how much time passes, the truth is always worth fighting for. Brenda DuPont was a 29-year-old woman living a quiet but fulfilling life in Opelousas, Louisiana. She rented a small efficiency apartment behind her sister Linda's house, where she enjoyed the comfort of being close to family. Brenda wasn't the type to chase grand ambitions. Instead, she found joy in life's simple pleasures. Every morning, she would sit with a friend over a cup of coffee, sharing stories, laughing, and preparing for the day ahead. She had a close-knit family, a sense of routine, and the warmth of familiarity surrounding her. For those who knew her, Brenda was kind, gentle, and deeply loved. But one morning, she didn't show up for coffee, and from that moment, everything changed. When Brenda failed to answer the door, concern turned into fear. Her nephew, Lee Herbert, was sent to check on her, knocking on her door multiple times. Each knock was met with silence. It was unusual, unsettling even. Brenda never ignored her family. After the third or fourth attempt, Linda's unease turned into full-blown panic. She rushed to her landlord's house asking to use the phone. She dialed the police, certain that something terrible had happened. When officers arrived, they found Brenda's front door locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no immediate clue as to what had happened inside. Officers knocked, calling her name, but the silence remained unbroken. One officer moved to the back of the small apartment and noticed an open window. Stepping closer, she peered inside. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. Brenda's body lay motionless on the floor. The officer immediately called for entry, and with urgency, a policewoman kicked the front door open. What they found inside was beyond horrifying. Brenda's mattress was tilted, partially covering her body, which was slumped against the bed frame in a fetal position. Her eyes were open, yet lifeless, her body still. Blood covered the floor, her sheets, the walls, evidence of a savage attack. It was a crime of unthinkable violence. When Linda entered behind the officers, the sight of her sister's brutalized body sent her into a state of shock. Her scream echoed through the small apartment, raw and filled with agony. The realization that Brenda was gone, taken in such a horrific way, shattered her. The grief was immediate, suffocating. But before she could fully process the loss, there was something even more painful to do, calling the rest of the family to tell them that Brenda was dead. As police examined the crime scene, it became clear that this was not just a murder. Brenda had been stabbed multiple times, but that wasn't the only sign of brutality. There were bite marks on her body, clear indications of a violent struggle. She had no clothes on, leading investigators to believe that a sexual assault had occurred. A rape kit was ordered, and the search for the murder weapon began. But there was nothing. No knife, no blunt object, nothing that could be linked to the crime. The biggest mystery was how the killer had entered. The door was locked. The only open access point was the window. And yet, who breaks into a home through a window only to leave through the same window? Detectives quickly arrived at one conclusion. Brenda had let her killer in. This was someone she knew. The first people police questioned were those closest to Brenda, her sister Linda, and Linda's boyfriend, Diker Chavis. They were interrogated extensively, asked repeatedly if they knew anything, if they were involved. Linda was outraged. How could they even consider that she had hurt her own sister? She demanded they look elsewhere. "Nobody in my house did this," she insisted. "If y'all want to find the real murderer, go out and find him." The investigation pressed on, but there were no witnesses, no solid suspects, and no immediate leads. The evidence collected, over 75 items, was sent to the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab, where analysts examined the rape kit. They found seminal fluid, confirming that a sexual assault had taken place. More importantly, spermatozoa were detected, meaning the killer had left behind DNA. But this was 1988, a time when DNA testing was in its infancy. There were no databases to compare it to, no way to immediately identify the person responsible. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and as the years passed, the case grew cold. For nearly 24 years, Brenda's family was left with nothing but unanswered questions. The pain of losing her never faded, but the hope of justice slowly dimmed. Then, in 2012, everything changed. Technology had advanced, and forensic DNA testing had become far more sophisticated. Investigators decided to reopen Brenda's case, running the preserved DNA samples through a national database. This time, they got a match. A name appeared on the screen: Jonelle Rubin. To some, the name meant nothing, but for law enforcement in Opelousas, it rang a bell. Rubin had been 18 years old at the time of Brenda's murder. He lived in the area. He had a criminal record. And back in 1988, he had even been questioned in connection with the case. But at the time, he had provided an alibi. He claimed he was with his girlfriend, Stephanie Keys, the night Brenda was killed. Police never verified his story. Now, with DNA evidence linking him to Brenda, detectives went back to Keys. Could she confirm that she was with Rubin that night? Her response was unsettling. "I honestly can't remember." That one statement dismantled the alibi that had kept Rubin from being a suspect for over 2 decades. But then, Linda remembered something else. The night before Brenda was murdered, Rubin had been at her house. He had been playing with a knife. She had told him to leave. That single piece of information, combined with the DNA match, was enough for police to move forward. At the time of the discovery, Rubin was already in jail on a domestic abuse charge. Detectives brought him in for questioning, confronting him with the DNA evidence. "We have a vaginal swab from Brenda DuPont," an officer told him. "And it matches you." Rubin shook his head. "Not mine," he said. "Not mine." But the DNA didn't lie. A warrant was issued and Jonelle Rubin was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated rape. For Brenda's family, the arrest was overwhelming. Linda received the call she had waited 24 years for. "We made an arrest," the officer told her. "Who?" she asked, barely able to speak. "Jonelle Rubin." She exhaled, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. "After 24 years, she whispered, y'all finally got him." In 2016, Rubin stood trial. The evidence was undeniable. His DNA was inside Brenda. He had been in the area. He had played with a knife the night before. It took the jury just 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. Jonelle Rubin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, his face finally cracked. A single tear rolled down his cheek. For nearly 3 decades, he had believed he had gotten away with it. But now, justice had caught up to him. Jonelle Rubin sat motionless as the verdict was read. The reality of what had just happened seemed to hit him all at once. His expression remained unreadable at first, but as he was handcuffed and led away, his face twisted and a single tear slid down his cheek. For years he had lived his life freely, never facing consequences for what he had done. He had built a life, walked the streets without fear, while Brenda's family lived in the shadow of loss and unanswered questions. But now justice had caught up with him. The weight of the past had finally come crashing down. His conviction sent ripples through the community. People who had known him as a reckless teenager in 1988 were now seeing him as a convicted murderer. For some, it was a shock. After all, he had managed to avoid suspicion for so long. But for those who had always known he was trouble, it felt like an overdue reckoning. Rubin's defense team attempted to argue that the DNA evidence only proved sexual contact, not murder. They hinted at the possibility that Brenda had engaged with Rubin willingly and that someone else had killed her. But the brutality of the crime, the locked door theory, and the witness testimony about Ruben playing with a knife the night before painted a much darker picture. The jury didn't buy his defense. During sentencing, Brenda's family was given a chance to speak. Linda, who had waited more than 2 decades for this moment, stood before the courtroom and addressed Ruben directly. Her voice trembled, but she refused to let him see her break. "You took my sister away from us," she said. "You took her life, and you walked around like nothing happened. But now you'll sit in a cell and remember what you did every single day for the rest of your life." Other family members spoke, each voice filled with the weight of years of pain. They talked about Brenda, the life she never got to live, the memories they were robbed of. Some cried, some shouted, some simply shook their heads, unable to understand how a person could commit such an act of cruelty and then live freely for so many years. Ruben remained silent. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply stared at the floor, knowing that nothing he said could change what was happening. The judge sentenced Jonel Ruben to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, locked away for the crime he thought had been buried by time. After the trial, Ruben was transferred to Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola Prison, one of the most notorious correctional facilities in the country. It was a place known for housing some of the most violent offenders, a place where men spent their final years paying for the lives they had taken. It was there that Ruben would live out his days, far removed from the world he once walked so freely in. The news of his conviction brought a mixture of emotions from those who knew him. Some of his relatives insisted he was innocent, that the DNA evidence was misleading, that the case had been mishandled. Others distanced themselves from him completely, unwilling to defend someone convicted of such a brutal crime. For Brenda's family, the emotions were even more complex. There was relief. After all these years, they finally had an answer. They finally knew who had taken Brenda from them. But there was also a deep sadness. No conviction, no sentence, no courtroom victory could bring her back. There would always be an empty space at the table, a missing laugh, a missing presence. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain. In the years that followed, Linda and her family tried to move forward, carrying Brenda's memory with them. They honored her on anniversaries, kept her pictures close, and spoke about her often. She would never be forgotten. And as for Ruben, he remained in his prison cell, his days no longer filled with freedom, but with the quiet torment of knowing that time had finally caught up with him. Cold cases don't stay cold forever. They wait, and in time justice finds a way. But there are still countless unsolved cases, countless families still waiting for answers. Justice doesn't happen on its own. It takes persistence, advancements in technology, and the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up. If you know something about an unsolved case, no matter how small the detail may seem, speak up. Your information could be the missing piece that brings justice to another family, just like Brenda's. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It only waits to be uncovered.